The first thing Lyra Sterling ever said to me was a question designed to make me feel like a mistake. Not a rhetorical question, not a philosophical one. The kind of question that's built like a trap, baited with technical language and sprung with a smile so precise it could have been drafted on a drafting table. I was sitting at the third table from the window in the Sterling Library. Her family's library. A fact that the building's brass plaque reminded everyone of with quiet, relentless dignity. And I had not slept in 26 hours. I had coffee that had stopped being hot sometime around midnight. I had 4 versions of the same structural drawing spread across the table like the shed skins of some architectural snake, each one more desperate than the last, and I had 17 minutes left before the graduate studio closed, and I would have to pack up everything and carry it 14 blocks through February in Vermont, which is the kind of February that makes you understand why certain animals choose hibernation as a lifestyle. I was fine. I was absolutely fine. And then the air in the room changed. Not the temperature, not the pressure, just the quality of it. The way a room's entire atmosphere can shift when a specific person enters it. And I looked up. If you've ever been caught off guard by someone who made your heart contradict itself, or if you just love a story where love hides behind the last thing you'd expect, like me, and hit that subscribe button, you won't want to miss what happens next. Lyra Sterling moved through spaces the way load-bearing walls hold up buildings, with a certainty so fundamental that the structure around her seemed to exist because of her, not the other way around. She was wearing a coat the color of deep charcoal. Cashmere, obviously. Everything on her body was obviously cashmere or something equally engineered to signal that cost was not a factor she considered. And her dark hair was pulled back with the kind of effortless severity that takes either natural elegance or a very expensive stylist to achieve. She was carrying a leather portfolio under one arm and a takeaway cup of something that smelled like actual good coffee, the kind that costs $8 and is worth it, not the kind I'd been nursing since 11 p.m. from the vending machine on the second floor. She didn't look at me when she walked past. That was the thing about Lyra in those first weeks of spring semester. She didn't look at you. She assessed you. There was a difference, and you felt it in the back of your neck when it happened, that slow, methodical sweep of her attention that wasn't quite a gaze. It was more like the way a surveyor reads terrain, not interested in its beauty, only in its utility or its flaw. She stopped. Not because she had reached her destination. She stopped the way someone stops when they've noticed something they hadn't expected to find in a place they believed they already fully understood. She was beside my table. I could see, in my peripheral vision, that she was looking at my drawings. Not at me. At the drawings. And then she set down her coffee cup with a small, decisive click on the table's edge, and she bent slightly forward, just slightly, like she was too proud to bend further. And she looked at the structural elevation I'd spent 6 hours on, the one I was most proud of, the one I had nearly cried over at 3 a.m. when it finally started to make sense. She looked at it for 2 seconds. Exactly 2 seconds. I counted. The symmetry is wrong, Rossi. Her voice had that quality. The quality that very particular kinds of privilege produce. Not loud, not aggressive, but utterly certain. Certainty so deep it doesn't need volume. A voice that assumes the room is listening, because the room has always listened. Because in every room she has ever entered, the room has always listened. You're either trying to build a building, she said, straightening up and retrieving her coffee, or you're trying to construct an excuse for your own failure. At this point, I genuinely cannot tell which. And then she walked away. She walked to the long table at the far end of the room, the one near the tall arched window that overlooked the courtyard, the one that everyone in the graduate architecture program knew was hers. Not officially, not by any rule written in the university handbook, but by that other kind of rule, the kind written in the social architecture of a place like Caldwell University, the kind that didn't need to be spoken because it was already understood by everyone who mattered, and the people it wasn't understood by were, by definition, not the people who mattered. I sat there, and I felt my face do something complicated. My jaw tightened. My hands, which had been resting flat on the table, curled inward until I was gripping the edge of the drawing table hard enough that the paper crinkled slightly at the corner. I felt something hot move through my chest. Not quite anger, or not just anger, but something that anger was the topmost layer of, the way a river's surface is the topmost layer of everything underneath it. Cold water and sediment and things that haven't seen light in a long time. The symmetry is wrong. Rossi. I looked at my drawing. I looked at it for a long time. And the worst possible thing happened. The thing I had been hoping would not happen. The thing that would have made this moment simply infuriating rather than infuriating, and something else entirely. The thing that happened was, I looked at the symmetry, and I saw what she had seen in 2 seconds, and she was right. Not entirely right. The principle of the design was sound, the structural logic was there, the intent was legible. But the symmetry, the north elevation's response to the east facade, there was a 1.3 centimeter error in the grid that had been propagating across every subsequent drawing like a very quiet, very destructive lie told early in a long story. She had seen it in 2 seconds. I hadn't seen it in 6 hours. I put my forehead down on the drafting paper and stayed there for a moment that I am choosing not to quantify. My name is Maya Rossi, and I am the first person in my family's history to attend a graduate program at an Ivy League university, which sounds like the beginning of an inspirational speech, but is actually the beginning of a very specific kind of exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep, though I am also always tired. It's the exhaustion of perpetual translation, of moving between 2 worlds that don't share a language, of being both fluent enough in the language of this place to survive in it, and foreign enough to it that surviving takes everything you have. I grew up in Providence, Rhode Island, in a neighborhood that Caldwell University's admissions brochures would describe as underserved, if they ever acknowledged it existed, which they didn't. My mother is a nurse who works nights. My father is a construction foreman who worked his way up from general labor and who has opinions about structural load that are entirely empirical and entirely correct. I have 2 younger brothers who I helped raise in the gap between my mother's shifts and my father's overtime hours. And I have a grandmother who came from Catania with $30 and a recipe for arancini, and built an entire life from those 2 things, which is the most structurally impressive feat I've ever personally witnessed. Architecture made sense to me the way it makes sense to people who've grown up understanding that shelter is not decorative, that it is the difference between a family staying whole and a family coming apart. I drew buildings obsessively as a kid. I drew the buildings in my neighborhood and imagined versions of them that didn't leak, that had more light, that had the kind of staircases that felt like invitations rather than obstacles. I got a scholarship to undergrad. I worked 3 jobs. I graduated with the highest GPA in my program, and then Caldwell offered me a full graduate fellowship, housing stipend, tuition, everything. And I understood that it was the kind of opportunity that, if you didn't take it, you would spend the rest of your life wondering what happened to the person who did. So I took it. And I moved to Vermont in September, into the graduate housing that was slightly warmer than described and significantly smaller than photographed, and I started learning the other kind of architecture. The invisible one, the social skeleton that holds up a place like Caldwell, the way rebar holds up concrete, the hierarchy of last names, the casual geography of who sits where and why, the elaborate, unspoken grammar of who speaks first in a seminar and who speaks in response to whom, and what kind of silence follows what kind of statement. And at the center of that invisible structure, in those early months, was Lyra Sterling. She was not the loudest person in the room. She was never the loudest person in any room. She didn't need to be, and I think she knew it. And I think the knowing was something she wore so naturally, she might have been born with it. The way you can be born with good bone structure, or a reliable immune system. She was 3rd year, specializing in adaptive reuse and historic preservation, and her thesis project, which I'd seen referenced in the department's internal newsletter, the one they sent out with the kind of optimistic pride that departments feel about their most impressive students, was a proposal to redesign a decommissioned textile mill in upstate New York, turning it into a mixed-use community space while preserving the structural honesty of the original industrial building. It was brilliant. I hated that it was brilliant. Not because I wanted her to be mediocre, I had no investment in her mediocrity, but because brilliant people who are also cruel create a very specific kind of cognitive dissonance. Because the part of me that understood architecture, that had been understanding it since I was 9 years old, drawing fire escapes on the backs of grocery receipts, that part of me could look at her published work and feel the clean, involuntary response that good work produces: recognition, respect, the acknowledgement that someone else understands something real. And then the other part of me would remember, the symmetry is wrong, Rossi. And the recognition would curdle into something I didn't have a precise word for. She had made that comment in the 2nd week of January. It was now the 3rd week of February. In that intervening time, she had made, by my count, 7 other comments of similar caliber. Not daily. She was too precise for that, too strategic in her cruelty, which somehow made it worse. It wasn't a campaign. It was more like an occasional maintenance procedure, like she checked in every 10 days or so to ensure that I understood the exact nature of my position here. Once she'd pointed out, in a group critique session with Professor Alderman, that my material palette was technically competent but imaginatively cautious, which was the most sophisticated way anyone had ever called something both passing and insufficient simultaneously. Once she'd mentioned, in passing, in the hallway, that the way I detailed the junction between the curtain wall and the floor plate on my housing project reminded her of a student who has read all the right books and understood none of them, which I had replayed in my head for 4 days trying to find the exact location of the wound. And once, just once, she had said nothing. She had looked at something I'd made, a physical model I'd built over a weekend, balsa wood and laser-cut acrylic, 3 days of work. And she had looked at it for longer than 2 seconds, maybe 8 or 10, and her expression had done something that I couldn't fully categorize. Not contempt, not the architecture of dismissal she usually constructed, something else. Something that passed through her face like weather passing through a valley. Brief, real, and gone before you could be certain you'd seen it. And then she had walked away without saying anything, which was, in its own way, the most disorienting response she'd ever given me. I had thought about that look for longer than I was willing to admit. I had thought about it the way you think about an error you can't locate in a structural calculation, with the persistent, nagging certainty that something is wrong with your understanding of the problem, that the mistake is somewhere in your own assumptions rather than in the data itself. The night of the notebook began, as most of the significant events of my graduate career began, with sleep deprivation and a deadline. It was a Tuesday, technically a Wednesday by the time the library's old radiators were the only sound in the room, a steady, arthritic knocking that the building's maintenance staff had apparently given up correcting sometime in the previous century. The architecture graduate students had library access until 2 a.m., a privilege that most of us used with the enthusiasm of people who have no other options. I had spread across the table in my usual configuration. Drawings on the left, laptop in the center, coffee, cold, always cold, at the right edge, where I couldn't knock it onto anything important. My phone was face down. I had learned to put my phone face down in the library because the notifications from my brothers, funny videos, complaints about homework, pictures of the dog they weren't supposed to have but definitely had, would pull me out of focus at exactly the wrong moments. And focus was the thing I had instead of the ease that the other students carried with them like a second inheritance. It was the final push before the mid-semester review. 3 weeks away, but 3 weeks in graduate architecture time is a measurement that bears no relationship to 3 weeks in ordinary calendar time. 3 weeks was 8 or 9 complete all-nighters, a number of partial breakdowns kept private with strategic bathroom visits, 17 revisions to a project that was still not right, and a permanent low-grade state of anxiety that I had come to think of as my resting operating system. I was working on the section drawing. The section is the truth of a building, The cut through the middle that shows how all the layers actually work together, how the floor meets the wall, how the light moves through the interior, how the structure carries its load in the vertical dimension. It's the drawing that lies least, because it shows everything from the inside. I had been working on it for 3 hours, and it was finally starting to feel like something real, like the building I was designing was becoming more itself with each line, which is the feeling that makes all of the other feelings bearable. The library was not empty. It rarely was at this hour. 2 other graduate students, Omar, who was working on his thesis about vernacular construction in Morocco, and who listened to Fayrouz through earbuds at a volume that was technically audible across the room, and Ji-hyun, who was composing her sustainability report with the focused intensity of someone performing surgery, were at other tables. Professor Alderman's research assistant, a perpetually caffeinated second year named Russell, was at the periodicals desk, doing something administrative on a university laptop. The librarian on night duty, a woman named Patricia who had worked in this building for 22 years, and who I liked enormously because she treated everyone who came through the door with exactly the same quality of attention, was at the circulation desk with a novel. And then, at 11:47 p.m., the door opened. I knew it was Lyra before I looked up. I knew it the way you develop a kind of environmental awareness about certain people, the way your nervous system logs their presence before your conscious mind has processed it. The door opened, and something in my posture changed. A small, involuntary adjustment, the way your body calibrates when it registers something it has a complex relationship with. I kept my eyes on my drawing. I was determined to keep my eyes on my drawing, but I heard her. The particular cadence of her shoes on the library's stone floor, heels, always heels, even at midnight, which was either commitment or pathology, and I genuinely couldn't determine which. The shift of her portfolio strap, the quiet acknowledgement she exchanged with Patricia at the desk, the exact quality of silence that followed her path through the room. She walked to her table. Naturally, I allowed myself one look, diagnostic, quick, deliberate, the way you allow yourself to look at a source of stress just long enough to confirm it's still there, and no larger than before. She was settling in at the window table, unzipping her portfolio with the focused movements of someone who had a specific task in mind. She had a leather notebook, black, substantial, the kind of notebook that costs $40 and is intended to hold serious things, and she set it to the left of her working space. She pulled out her drafting tools. She put her phone face up on the table edge, which I noticed because I'd put mine face down, which is not a significant observation, and yet I made it. I looked back at my drawing. The section line was waiting. For the next 40 minutes, I drew and she drew, and the library was that specific kind of late-night quiet that feels almost collaborative, like everyone awake at that hour has agreed to share something unnamed. Omar's Fayrouz reached some emotional crescendo in his earbuds that made him exhale softly. Ji-hyun's keyboard clicked in even, focused bursts. The radiator knocked its slow complaint. Outside, the wind had picked up. February in Vermont has a particular kind of wind that is less like weather and more like an opinion the landscape has decided to share at high volume. And it pressed against the tall arched windows with a pressure that was almost rhythmic. I was, despite everything, almost content. This was the thing that I found hardest to explain to people outside of architecture, that even in the worst versions of it, even when you were exhausted and underfunded and being intermittently dismantled by someone whose family name was on the building you were sitting in, there were these moments when the work itself was enough, when the line you were drawing was the truest thing in the room, when the building existed, really existed, in the space between the pencil and the paper, and you were less a person having a hard time than you were a conduit for something that wanted to be real. I was in one of those moments when I heard the chair at the window table scrape back. I heard her gather her things, the specific sounds of packing up, portfolio zipped, pencils capped, coat lifted from the back of the chair. I heard her exchange another word with Patricia. I heard her shoes on the stone floor, moving toward the door, and I kept my eyes on my drawing, and the door opened and closed. The room settled back into its late-night quality. I drew for another 20 minutes, and then I set down my pencil and stretched my hands above my head, feeling the specific ache of sustained fine motor work in the joints of my fingers. And I looked around the room the way you look around a room you've almost forgotten you're in. And I saw it. It was on the floor under the window table, half tucked beneath the leg of the chair she'd just vacated, dark against the dark stone. A rectangle of black leather, small enough to have slipped from the table unnoticed, large enough that I could see exactly what it was from where I was sitting. Her notebook. I didn't move immediately. I sat there for a moment that lasted long enough for me to have several distinct, sequential thoughts. The first thought was, she'll realize she forgot it and come back. The second thought was, it's 11:58 p.m. in February in Vermont, and the library closes in 2 minutes, and she's already left, and she won't come back tonight. The third thought was, I should give it to Patricia, who can hold it at the desk. The fourth thought, and this one arrived with a quality I didn't fully examine, was, or I could look at what's in it. I want to be honest about this. I want to be the kind of narrator who doesn't make herself look better than she was. The truth is that the thought of looking at Lyra Sterling's notebook arrived not as an ethical question, but as something closer to temptation in its most direct form. The simple, physical pull toward something forbidden that bypasses the deliberating mind and goes straight to the hands. I was tired. I had been dismissed and diminished 7 times in 7 weeks. I was 23 years old, and I was the first person in my family to be here, and it was costing me everything. And she had never once, not once, treated me like someone who had earned her way into the room. Maybe I just wanted to understand her. Maybe I wanted to find something small and human in all that polished certainty. Maybe I was just very tired, and the notebook was right there. I stood up. I crossed the room. I picked it up. It was heavier than I'd expected. Densely used. Pages filled with enough pressure to have given the cover a slight warp on one side. I could feel through the leather the raised texture of pages that had been drawn on with force. I turned it over in my hands. There was no name on the cover. No external identification. Just the leather, dark and worn at the corners, in the way things get worn when they're used every day. Patricia was shutting down the circulation desk. Library's closing in 3 minutes, hon, she said without looking up. I know, I said. I just found this. It belongs to one of the other students. I'll make sure she gets it. That's fine. Patricia reached for her coat. You're good, Maya. Lock it behind you when you go, the key's in the usual spot. I was trusted with the library key because I was always the last one to leave. This was the kind of institutional trust that felt simultaneously like an honor and a commentary on my social life. I tucked the notebook under my arm and went back to my table to pack up my own things. I told myself I was going to bring it straight to Lyra's mailbox in the department hallway. I told myself that clearly and specifically, the way you tell yourself something when you already know you're going to do something else. I brought the notebook home. My apartment. A 1-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building that had the architectural integrity of a strong suggestion, was 14 blocks from the library, and I walked them fast, the way you walk in February when the wind has opinions about your face. I had the notebook in my bag, and I was thinking about it the way you think about something you know is there, with that specific awareness of a weight that isn't quite physical, the kind of attention that tugs at the corner of your thoughts even when you're directing them elsewhere. I made tea. I made it slowly, deliberately, the way my grandmother made everything, with the suggestion that the act of making it was as important as the having of it. I sat at my kitchen table, which was a door panel on 2 sawhorses that I had painted white, and which I considered one of my better spatial solutions. I put the notebook on the table in front of me. I sat with it for a while. The tea cooled slightly. Outside, the wind continued its conversation with the building's old frame. Then I opened it. I expected... What did I expect? I think I expected something that would confirm what I already believed about Lyra Sterling. Rigorous, cold, technically magnificent, and fundamentally indifferent to anything that couldn't be expressed in structural terms. I expected calculations. I expected her thesis notes, the material specifications, the annotated bibliography of a mind that understood the world as a series of problems to be solved with sufficient precision and sufficient resource. The first page was exactly that. Load calculations for the mill building's rehabilitated floor system. Dense, exact, annotated with a handwriting that was somehow both architectural and personal. Precise letter forms that occasionally ran together at the end of a line with something like impatience. Notes in the margin about the tensile properties of the original cast iron columns. A small sketch of the column capital with 3 alternative approaches to the restoration detail. The work of a very good structural mind that had done its homework and then done it again to be sure. I turned the page. More of the same. A site section showing the relationship between the mill building and the adjacent river. Elevation studies for the new fenestration strategy. A photograph, glued to the page, of the existing brick facade, with penciled annotations pointing to areas of deterioration and areas of structural integrity. I turned 3 more pages, and then something changed. The page I was looking at was divided, like the previous ones, between technical content and margin notes. In the lower left quadrant, where there had been a structural diagram on the previous pages, there was instead a drawing, a figure study, small and dense, done in what looked like charcoal or a very soft pencil. The marks had the quality of something built up in layers, with an erasure here and there that left a ghosting rather than a removal. It was a figure at a table. A woman at a table, bent over a drawing, her hair, thick, slightly unruly, pulled back with what appeared to be a pen, falling forward toward the paper. The figure's left hand was pressed flat on the table. The right hand held a pencil. The face was in 3/4 profile, tilted down toward the work. I looked at the drawing for a long time. Then I turned to the next page. The same figure, different moment. Standing this time, one hand braced against a wall, looking at something out of the drawing's frame. The posture had that quality I'd felt in my own body 100 times, the quality of being so absorbed in looking at something that you forget to arrange yourself for other people's observation. There was something almost private about the figure's stance, something that suggested the person drawing it had seen something they weren't supposed to have seen. I turned the page. The figure again. Outside this time, under trees, the line of bare branches suggested winter or early spring, a specific quality of leafless light that you get in New England when the air is cold enough to be blue, but the sun is still there, still trying. The figure was walking, looking down at something in her hands, coat open despite the cold in a way that spoke of being too absorbed to register temperature. There was a small smile, barely indicated, more suggested than drawn, in the slight upward movement of one corner of the mouth. I knew the coat. I knew the coat because it was my coat. A burgundy wool coat that I'd bought secondhand junior year of undergrad from a vintage shop in Providence that had a small repair on the left cuff that you could see if you knew to look for it, that I wore every day from October through March because Vermont had made its position on temperature very clear, and I had made mine equally clear in response. The figure in the drawing was me. The figure in every drawing was me. I turned pages with a different quality of attention now. Faster. Not frantic, but insistent. The way you read a building after you understand its organizing logic. The way the whole suddenly makes sense when you find the right key. Page after page after page, and in the margins, around the structural calculations and the material notes and the thesis annotations. She had drawn me. Maya resting her chin on her hand in a lecture, looking slightly skeptical of something being presented at the front of the room. Maya carrying a rolled tube of drawings under both arms, navigating the narrow corridor between the model shop and the studio. Maya in the courtyard between classes, phone in one hand, the other tracing a detail on the brick wall in the way architects touch buildings, the way it's less about feeling and more about understanding. Maya biting the end of a pencil. This one had a note in the margin. She does this when she's working something out and doesn't know it. Architectural thinking. Pre-verbal. Maya laughing at something off to the left of the frame. No note. Just the drawing, which was the most technically careful of any of them. The lines built up with a patience that seemed to exceed what the subject required. Maya walking out of a studio crit with the particular posture of someone who has just received difficult feedback and is processing it with controlled dignity. Margin note. She never lets them see. I don't know if I find this admirable or lonely. Probably both. I sat very still. The tea was cold. I turned to the page where the character of the notebook changed again. Shifted from drawings with margin notes to something that was unambiguously the other direction. Words, in the center of the page, with occasional sketches at the margin. The handwriting was the same, precise, slightly rushed at the ends of lines. But the content was something I had not prepared myself for. She came in late today. The studio was almost done. She went straight to work like there was no one else in the room, like the room was a tool, and she was using it. I've been doing this long enough to know the difference between people who perform working and people who actually work. She actually works. She's one of maybe 4 people in this department who actually works. The project she's developing is structurally conservative and experientially adventurous, which is the inverse of my usual approach. I keep looking at it. I keep thinking about the section, the way she's handling the threshold between inside and outside, the graduation from one to the other, the way it resists the binary. I haven't told her. I won't tell her. I turned the page. I made a comment today that I shouldn't have made. The comment was technically accurate, which I told myself was sufficient justification. It wasn't. The symmetry error was real, 1.3 centimeters in the grid, propagating across every subsequent sheet. But I could have mentioned it differently. I could have mentioned it as a question. I could have left a note. There were options, and I chose the one that put the most distance between us, which is the one I always choose, because distance is the only architecture I'm consistently good at. I read that paragraph 3 times. 1.3 centimeters. She had counted. She had found it. And she had counted the exact magnitude of the error, and she had written it in her notebook at some point after the exchange in the library. And I was reading it now at 1:30 a.m. at my door panel kitchen table, and my hands were not entirely steady. I kept reading. She's a scholarship student, fully funded fellowship. I looked it up in the department directory, which I recognize as a violation of the kind of social contract I would normally feel strongly about maintaining. But I was thinking about the project. I was thinking about the section drawing. I wanted to understand where she came from because the way someone came from somewhere is always in the work, if you know how to look. Her father is in construction. Her mother is in healthcare. She's from Providence. She won the Belden Fellowship, which is the most competitive graduate architecture fellowship in the country, and she got it as a first-generation student from a public undergraduate program, which means she didn't get it because of who she knew. She got it because of the work. I've been getting things because of who I know my entire life. I understand, technically, that this is not equivalent. I don't know what to do with that understanding. The next entry was dated a week later. She sat near the window today for the first time. The light through the east window in the late afternoon falls in a way that makes the drawing table look like something out of a Hopper painting. That quality of American loneliness that is also American concentration. She was working on her site model. She had her hair down, which she doesn't usually, and she was using both hands on the model, shaping the terrain. And I was supposed to be looking at my own work, and instead I was looking at her hands and thinking about the load-bearing capacity of very specific kinds of attention. I'm aware that this is not a thought a structurally sound person would have. I'm noting it anyway. Load-bearing attention. That's one for the vocabulary. I turned the page. There was a longer entry here, longer than the others, written with less precision, the handwriting slightly uneven in a way that suggested it had been written faster or later at night, or both. I need to say something clearly, even if no one will read this, even if I never read this again. She is the only person in this building who makes me feel like the ground might be less certain than I've been told it is. I've been told the ground is very certain my whole life. I've been told exactly what it's made of and exactly where it is, and exactly how much I can count on it. I've been told what a Sterling does with her education, and what a Sterling does with her talent, and what a Sterling does with the rest of it, the parts of herself that don't fit into the plan. What you do is you don't talk about them, and you don't let them show. And you keep them very quiet in a notebook that you write in at midnight, and will never show anyone. She is the only angle I can't align, the only structure that makes me want to come apart at the joints. That's the clearest I can say it. I don't have better language than that. I understand load distribution and shear force and the way a cantilevered element wants to rotate at its fixed end, and I understand none of this. None of the way she tilts her head when she's thinking. None of the way she talks to other people like they matter to her by default. None of the way she walked into a place that was built to make her feel like a guest and started behaving like she belonged here. Not because she was pretending, but because she decided it was true. I don't know how someone decides something like that. I wasn't given the option to decide things like that. You're born into it or you're not. That's what I was taught. And she is here, in my library, in my family's library that has my family's name on the building, and she is more certain of her right to be here than I've ever been certain of anything. That's the thing I don't want anyone to know, that she frightens me. Not in the way things frighten you when they're dangerous. In the way things frighten you when they're true. I closed the notebook. I sat with it closed in front of me for a long time. Long enough that the radiator in my apartment went through its full cycle twice, its own clanking narrative running underneath the silence. My tea was cold. My coat was still on. I hadn't noticed, through all of it, that I'd never taken off my coat. I opened the notebook again. There were more entries, more drawings, more margin notes that I could have read, and probably would have read eventually, if I'd let myself keep going. But I stopped at the last one I'd read, the one with the handwriting that was slightly less controlled than the others, the one that ended with the word true. That she frightens me, not in the way things frightened you when they're dangerous, in the way things frighten you when they're true. I thought about the comment in the library. The symmetry is wrong, Rossi. I thought about 7 weeks of being dismantled with technical accuracy. I thought about the drawing of me biting the end of a pencil, with the margin note. Architectural thinking. Pre-verbal. I thought about her watching me shape a site model in the afternoon light, and writing about load-bearing attention, like it was a concept she was trying to work out. I thought about her. At her window table, at midnight, in this building with her name on it, writing in a private notebook about the exact magnitude of her own fear, 1.3 centimeters at a time. And I felt something shift, not dramatically, not with any of the cinematic quality that the word shift usually suggests. More like what happens when a building settles. Quiet, subsurface, the structure adjusting to a new distribution of load. Something that had been in one configuration moving into another one. I wasn't less angry. I want to be clear about that. I was still angry about 7 weeks of being made to feel insufficient by someone who was apparently doing it because she didn't know how to do anything else with the way she felt. The anger was real, and it had earned its place, and I wasn't going to dismiss it because of a private notebook and some very good charcoal drawings. But anger, it turns out, is not the only thing that can occupy a space. It's not even always the largest thing. Sometimes the largest thing is something quieter, something that doesn't announce itself. The thing that was underneath the river surface all along, the cold water and the sediment, and the things that hadn't seen light. I put the notebook in my bag. I sat at my door panel table for another 20 minutes, not thinking about anything specific, just being with what had just happened to my understanding of the situation. Then I went to bed. I didn't sleep particularly well. This was not unusual. The whole semester had been characterized by a relationship with sleep that was more theoretical than practical. But this particular sleeplessness had a different quality than the anxiety of deadlines, or the background hum of financial precarity that I'd been carrying since September. It was the sleeplessness of a recalibration, the mind doing the work of adjusting to a new set of parameters, running the same data through a revised model, and finding that the outputs are different. I kept coming back to one thing, specifically. Not the drawings, though they were vivid enough that I could close my eyes and see them. The charcoal lines, the built-up layers, the erasures that weren't quite erasures. And not the longer journal entries, though the one about the ground being less certain than she'd been told played under my thoughts like a frequency you feel more than hear. The thing I kept coming back to was the 1.3 centimeters. She had not just noticed the error, she had measured it. At some point after leaving the library that evening in January, she had either returned to look at my drawing or had reproduced the error from memory, and either option said something significant about the quality of attention she'd been paying. You don't casually produce a measurement like that. 1.3 centimeters is not an approximation, not a roughly or an about. It's a precision that requires either care or obsession, and in Lyra Sterling's case, I was increasingly uncertain that those two things were meaningfully distinct. She had seen it in 2 seconds. She had measured it later. She had written it down. I lay in the dark of my apartment, listening to the building's heating system conduct its nightly monologue, and I thought about what it means to pay that quality of attention to something and then do nothing with it except keep it in a private notebook. I thought about all the things that can look like indifference when they're something else entirely. By the time the light behind my curtains started shifting from black to gray, Vermont February dawns have that quality of light that seems less like day arriving and more like darkness reluctantly conceding. I had made a decision. Or the decision had made itself in the quiet of my not sleeping. I'm not always sure those are different things. I was going to give the notebook back. Not to her mailbox, not to the department secretary, not to Patricia at the library circulation desk. I was going to give it back to Lyra Sterling directly. I was going to look her in the eyes when I gave it back to her, and I was going to see what happened to her face. Not as revenge. I want to be clear about that too. Not to catch her, not to expose her, not to use what I'd read as a weapon in some social calculation, but because something in me, the part that drew buildings by instinct at 9 years old, the part that understood that the truth of a structure is in the section, in the cut that shows what's really happening inside, that part needed to see it, needed to look at the real surface beneath the polished exterior, if only for the moment it took to pass a notebook from one hand to another. I needed to know if she would let me see it. I needed to know if she was capable of it. I got up. I made coffee. I looked out my window at a sky that was doing its best to look like morning. The street below was empty, except for a department vehicle salting the sidewalk with patient efficiency, preparing the ground for everyone who would need to walk on it. I picked up my bag. The notebook was in it. I could feel its weight. I went to class. 3 days passed between the night of the notebook and the confrontation in the studio. I'm not going to pretend that those 3 days were simple or that I moved through them with any particular grace. I walked around with the notebook in my bag and the knowledge it contained like a double weight, the physical object and the thing it had changed in my understanding, both present every time I shifted the strap on my shoulder. I saw Lyra twice in those 3 days. The first time was in the graduate corridor, on a Wednesday morning, when she came out of Professor Alderman's office with her portfolio and the particular composure of someone who has just had a productive meeting. She glanced at me. She glanced away. No comment, no assessment, just the neutral social acknowledgement of someone passing someone else in a hallway. It was the most ordinary interaction we had ever had, and it felt, under the present circumstances, deeply strange. The second time was in the studio, during an open working session, when she was 3 tables away from me and working on what looked like a revised section of the mill project. I was supposed to be working on my own section, the one that had finally resolved itself into something I believed in. I spent approximately 40 minutes working, and approximately 20 minutes in the highly inadvisable activity of watching her work. She worked the way the notebook suggested she worked, with total absorption, the kind of concentration that exists in its own sealed environment. She had a way of holding her pencil during detailed drawing, very close to the tip, almost where the graphite met the paper, that I hadn't noticed before, or rather, that I had noticed but not consciously categorized, and which I now noticed in a different way, with the awareness that she had noticed how I held mine. She had written architectural thinking, pre-verbal, in the margin beside a drawing of my hands. I looked away from her hands. I looked back at my section. It was better than it had been, significantly better. I had fixed the symmetry error, which still made me feel something complicated, the gratitude and the irritation perfectly inseparable. And the drawing now had the quality I'd been reaching for. A specificity that felt earned, like the building had stopped being an exercise and started being itself. I thought, she would see that if she looked at it. Then I thought, what does it mean that I care whether she would see it? I did not come up with a satisfying answer to that question in the time remaining. The confrontation happened on Friday evening, when the storm started. Vermont February storms come in two categories: the polite kind that snow for 6 hours and then stop and leave everything looking like a postcard, and the other kind that mean business, that build slowly through the afternoon with a specific quality of sky, that flat, pressurized white that people who grew up in New England learned to read like a text, and then, by early evening, are conducting themselves with the full authority of a natural phenomenon that has no interest in your plans. This was the second kind. I knew about the storm. Everyone knew about the storm. The university had sent 2 emails and a text message about it, and there had been a department-wide notification about the studio building's extended heating protocols, which was the kind of administrative preparation that implies the administration does not expect people to exercise good judgment and leave before it gets bad. I had not exercised good judgment and left before it got bad. The studio building, Callaway Hall, a 60s-era concrete building that was architecturally honest about what it was and didn't pretend otherwise, which I had always appreciated, had an annex at its eastern end, a converted greenhouse structure that served as the materials and model workshop. It had been retrofitted with heating over the years in a way that was structurally ad hoc, but functionally adequate, and it sat at the edge of the campus, nearest to the tree line, which in summer was pleasant, and in February, storm conditions was the kind of choice that looks like what it is. This was where I found her. I had gone to the studio building initially, with the entirely defensible purpose of working on my section drawing, which I genuinely intended to do, and the slightly less defensible purpose of being in a building where I might encounter Lyra Sterling, which I also intended to do. I had the notebook in my bag. I had been carrying it for 3 days. I was tired of carrying it. She wasn't in the main studio. I checked my own studio space, worked for 40 minutes on the section drawing, and then, with the storm properly announcing itself outside, the windows beginning to accumulate a layer of wind-blown snow that made the outside world look slightly impressionistic, I went looking. The workshop annex was lit from within with a warm, specific quality, the combination of fluorescent overheads and the freestanding incandescent lamps that some of the third years had brought in for better model-making light, a workaround for the studio's slightly clinical overhead lighting that everyone agreed was adequate and nobody liked. I could see the light through the annex's glazed panels from the connecting corridor, and I pushed open the door. She was the only one there. She was at the model-making table at the far end, standing, working on something at a scale I couldn't identify from the door, a model in the intermediate stage, where it's too built to look like nothing, and not built enough to look like itself. She had her coat on, the charcoal cashmere coat, and she hadn't heard me come in over the sound of the storm against the glass panels and whatever she was thinking about. I stood in the doorway for a moment. I was doing the calculation that I do. when I know I'm about to do something that cannot be undone. Not recalculating whether to do it. That decision had been made, quietly, in the dark of my apartment 3 mornings ago, just taking the last second of the configuration before it changed. Then I walked across the workshop. She heard me when I was about 6 feet away, the particular sound of someone else's shoes on concrete in a room where you thought you were alone. And she turned. Her face did the thing I'd come to understand was her resting state. Composed, attentive, the social architecture of someone who is always slightly more prepared than the moment requires. Ready to construct whatever expression the situation called for. And then she saw what I was holding. I had taken the notebook out of my bag in the corridor before entering the annex. I held it in front of me, both hands, open position, not presenting it like an accusation and not holding it close like a possession, just holding it, the way you hold something that belongs to someone else and that you want to return to them. Her face changed. It changed the way the building I'd been designing changed when I finally fixed the section. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with that quality of a structure finding its correct configuration, pieces moving into alignment that had been slightly off. The composed surface remained, but something underneath it shifted, and the shift was visible in exactly the places she'd been most careful to maintain. The set of her jaw, the precision of her posture, the carefully calibrated quality of her attention. The notebook was black. Her coat was charcoal. The snow was pressing against the glazed panels above us. The model on the table between us was half-built. She was looking at the notebook. She was not looking at me. "I found it in the library," I said. "Under the window table. Tuesday night." Silence. Outside, the storm escalated itself into the next register. A gust that pushed against the greenhouse, glazing with enough force to make the panels flex slightly. That particular sound of glass and wind negotiating terms. "You read it," she said. Not a question. A structural assessment. She had looked at the evidence. The notebook, my presence. The deliberateness of how I was holding it. And she had determined what it meant. And she was confirming her determination, not asking me to confirm it for her. "Yes," I said. The word sat between us in the workshop light. She turned back to the model on the table, picked up an X-Acto knife, set it down again. This was, I realized, the equivalent of the things I did with my hands when I was processing something I hadn't yet located language for. The physical displacement of internal management. "You should leave that with me," she said. Her voice had the particular quality of someone attempting to reconstruct composure from the inside out, and almost succeeding. "And we don't need to." "You wrote 1.3 centimeters, I said. She stopped. I watched her stop. I watched it move through her. The specific quality of being named, of having the private thing acknowledged in the room where the person it's about is standing. "The symmetry error," I said. "The propagating error in the grid. You measured it. After the library. You wrote down the exact measurement. That was a..." She started to say something, stopped, started again. "That was a technical observation. You drew me 23 times. The number had surprised me when I'd counted. I had counted on the second morning, more carefully than was probably advisable. 23 drawings in various margins, across what appeared to be 6 weeks of notebook entries. 23 different moments. Library, studio, corridor, courtyard, under the oak trees near the eastern edge of campus in afternoon light. The charcoal coat was mine. I'd bought it secondhand. I wore it every day, 23 times. Her back was to me. She had not turned around. "Lyra," I said. It was the first time I had used her first name. In 7 weeks, through 7 dismissals, I had never once called her anything except Sterling, in the way everyone called her Sterling, the way the name was a category rather than a person. Using it now felt like crossing the grid line, like finding the error in the symmetry and deciding this time to show what I'd found. She turned around. And there it was. The thing I'd come here to see. The surface beneath the polished surface, the section through the building showing what the building was actually made of. Not cruelty, not contempt, not the indifference I'd told myself it was, on the days when I needed it to be that simple. Fear, and something adjacent to fear. Something that fear lives next to when it's been in place for a very long time. The expression of someone who's been carrying an extremely heavy structural load for so long that they have stopped noticing the weight until someone points out that the foundation is showing the strain. She looked at me the way the notebook looked at me, completely, without the architecture. "You should have left it at the desk," she said. "I know," I said. "I didn't." Outside, the storm was making its most serious argument yet. The glazing panels flexed again, the frame of the greenhouse structure conducting the sound of wind through its bones. The overhead fluorescents hummed their even note. The model on the table sat half-built, its structural logic suspended mid-commitment. I held out the notebook. She looked at it. She looked at me. She did not take it. And I understood, in the particular way you understand things that don't have direct language yet, in the way you understand the truth of a building from its section, from the cut through the middle that shows you everything, that whatever came next was going to require us to speak in a different grammar than the one we'd been using. The storm, outside, was conducting itself with the full authority of something that doesn't care about the conversations happening inside the glass. We were inside the glass. Neither of us moved.